Hi, my name is Lucy Sanctuary, and I am a speech and language therapist and an ADOS-2 trainer. And I'm making this video to share 5 things with you that I think you need to know before you book onto the ADOS-2 training. Okay, these are the 5 that I'm going to discuss with you. So first, we're going to talk about what we know about autism currently, how the change to our knowledge and understanding has affected the diagnostic criteria, and what impact that has had on autism assessment. I'm going to talk about the ADOS-2 training, what it involves, and what the requirements are to be able to do that training. And then I'm also going to talk about work and how to develop the skills that you learn on the training to be able to assess. So we know so much more now than we did in 1980. We had the first diagnostic criteria for autism. It's been so much research and continues to be so much research all over the world that has helped increase our understanding and to improve life for neurodivergent people. So although we don't know the exact genes that are involved in autism, we do know that it tends to run in families and is highly heritable. We also know that autism cuts across gender, age, cultural and racial heritage, and basically that anyone can be autistic, whereas we didn't know that before. And initially autism was thought of very much as something which affected white boys, basically. We also know that autism and attention deficit hyperactive disorder are not mutually exclusive, and actually that there is a very high rate of co-occurrence. Whereas in the past, it was thought that you couldn't have both. So if you had ADHD, you couldn't be autistic and vice versa. Research has helped us learn as well about camouflaging or masking autistic features. So in the past, we didn't know about that. And as a result, lots of people were misdiagnosed or just missed. And we also know that autism presents in so many different ways that everybody who is autistic is a unique individual. And that wasn't fully realized before, which is kind of strange. But yeah, so, we've come really a long way. Research also shows that there are higher rates of mental health difficulties within the autistic population and other forms of neurodivergence. And in the past, that, often is the part that's visible that you see. And in the past, that often led to missing underlying forms of neurodivergence. But we know more about this now, so hopefully don't miss or misdiagnose so many people anymore. So this is the DSM criteria, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It is the American diagnostic criteria. And the first diagnostic criteria for autism, as I said earlier, was in 1980. That's the DSM-3. And the diagnostic label then was infantile autism, which was viewed as a rare disorder. And we used to really kind of see autism as being very much a childhood condition. It wasn't until later that people started to really realize that your neurotype is lifelong, not something that you grow out of or that only affects you for a certain part of your life. The DSM-3 was introduced, and then after a lot more research, it was revised to the DSM-4. And at that time, the spectrum was thought of as like being linear and as if there were points on that spectrum that you could categorize people really. So at one end, I mean, we had a stereotype at both ends really. So at one end you had the stereotyped kind of idea of autistic people with learning difficulties who were not using words to communicate. And at the other end, you had the stereotyped idea of like savant genius kind of Rain Man. And then in between, you had all these kind of like boxes where you would slot people depending on what they scored in assessment. So I think in a way, what was happening was that research was becoming more and more aware of the fact that there were that people were presenting in different ways. And so it was beginning to try to understand the huge range, like, all those different presentations that we see. So then more research and our understanding, knowledge increased even more. And now we have the DSM-5, which has done away with the idea of that line, an idea of like placing people in these kind of neat little categories. And so now we just have one diagnostic label, which is autism spectrum disorder. And now people talk about like a constellation of different autistic features, and that those will be unique to each person and that they'll change depending on the environment. So we are now much more aware of that kind of interface between surroundings and neurotype. Advances in our understanding improves not only assessment, but also support in schools, in the workplace, and also in mental health services. It's really important. Okay, so this is the current kind of gold standard model of assessment. There aren't any medical markers that we can find in order to diagnose autism. And so we always want to take a really wide look when we are assessing someone, because people are different in different situations. And if we focus too much of a narrow way, then we might not understand as much about that person as we need to if we're going to do an assessment. So all of the assessment tools are based on the diagnostic criteria, and people tend to use either the DSM-5, which is the American model that I was just talking about, or the ICD-11. So ICD stands for International Classification of Diseases, and we're up to number 11 so far. And this is the European diagnostic criteria. So there are different parts that make up the autism assessment. It is not just the ADOS. So one part is the developmental history. Very often people use things like the ADIR, which is the Autism Diagnostic Interview Revised, but there are other assessments that people use as well. So this is a series of questions based on the diagnostic criteria, which you're asking parents or caregivers, and you're really interested in finding out about the person when they were between the ages of 4 and 5. So we're looking for evidence of differences in the way that they processed information from a younger age. And then the ADOS is a direct observational assessment. The ADOS isn't the right assessment all the time, but it probably is one of the main things that people use. So this is carried out with the person that you're assessing, whether that is a child or a teenager or an adult. It is also based on the diagnostic criteria, and it is a series of tasks, and there are questions as well for older children and adults. Then we gather additional information. So, for example, information from school, from earlier settings, from university, from work. This information is also based on the diagnostic criteria. So we're looking for similar things, evidence of autistic features, but in different situations and settings. Sometimes I've assessed people, they're not in school, so then we get information from forest schools or from Cubs or Scouts or wherever we can, really, and other professionals might contribute information here as well, which is really helpful. And then this box here is about differential diagnosis. So we want to be sure that what we are seeing cannot be explained by something else. For example, anxiety. So we need to be able to know that although this person is anxious, if they are, that can't explain the other things that we're seeing. And there is not something else which explains their presentation more than autism. So you might screen for different mental health conditions. You might do another sensory screen. You might screen for activity levels. This kind of really depends on the presentation of the person that you are assessing. So you get a lot of information from this process. This is a picture of the ADOS-2. There's a lot of kit, as you can see. So the ADOS-2 has different modules. So the modules are different kind of versions, if you like, of the assessment. And you select a module based primarily on language level, but also some of them are related to age as well. And you do think about things like cognition at times too. Each module has its own set of resources and tasks that you're using, and all of this is in this great big box here. So let me tell you about the ADOS training briefly. So the ADOS training is an introduction, and it's really important to know that, because sometimes you can go and do training for assessments. So for example, I'm a speech and language therapist. I've done a lot of training in different speech and language therapy assessments, and I do the training, and of course I need to think about it a bit, and it's new, but I can start doing it like pretty quickly. That's not the same with the ADOS. The ADOS is more like learning to drive. That's kind of the best comparison I can make, really. So when you learn to drive, you have to do a lot of different things at once, and you have to know about a lot of different things. So you have to know the highway code, where all the buttons are on the car, what the different gears are, where the position is. There's a lot that you have to learn. And not only do you have to learn all those things, you also have to be able to do all those things at once. You know, and I remember when I was learning to drive, just being in a panic often, thinking, oh, you want me to do all of that at once? I just can't. And, you know, to be honest, at the beginning, the ADOS feels a bit like that, because you have to do many different things at once. There's so much going on. And like learning to drive, it does all come together. And then you find yourself being able to do all those things at once, but not overnight. So what we do in the training is we introduce you to the ADOS. We tell you about the history, how it came about, why it was developed. And then we introduce you to usually modules 1 to 4, but there is a 5th module, which is the toddler, which sometimes people have that in the training as well, or you can do an extra day. So we introduce you to the administration, the tasks that you'll be administering, the coding. The ADOS-2 is a standardised assessment, so we also tell you about the standardised conditions that we all have to follow. We also tell you about the validity of the ADOS, the research that was involved in making sure that it was a very, very reliable tool in identifying when someone is autistic and identifying when they are not autistic. We teach you about the coding conventions that are used, and we also talk about how to develop the skills that we are beginning to introduce you to, because it doesn't matter how long your course is, whether it's 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, you are still going to need support and time to practice those skills. And it's very important to know that fact. This is a quote from the manual. Even given a sufficient educational background and experience with autism, simple attendance at a workshop is not sufficient to ensure competent use of the ADOS-2. Yes, this is true. When I trained, actually I had been asked whether I would join a private practice to assess for autism. I didn't know enough about the ADOS training, and so I went and I did it, and I was thinking, this will be great, I'll just do this training and then I'll go and work in this practice and I'll assess people. So I did the training and thought, oh my goodness, there's no way that I can start doing assessments. And so I actually went back into the NHS at that point, and I was very lucky. I got a job which was just doing ADOS. It had, you know, a huge amount of support, and it was great. And, you know, you have to think about that bit of like how you're going to develop those skills, whether you are doing this for clinical reasons or for research purposes. So the criteria in America and in the UK is that you need to have a graduate degree in psychology or a related field. You need to have relevant experience working with autistic people and experience of administering assessments. You know, everyone who's autistic is completely different. So although you do the same ADOS, is never with the same person. So you're going to see and meet so many different types of people that if you don't have a wide enough knowledge of autism, then that's going to be really difficult. And also we need to know about ages and stages and developmental norms, so that when we're assessing, we know when something isn't what we would expect it to be. The ADOS involves different kind of areas, so there's a lot of speech and language in there. So you need to know about speech, you need to know about language, you need to know about communication and interaction, not to the level of a speech and language therapist, but you need to have some knowledge of that. We are coding sensory behaviours and interests, particular type of sensory behaviours and interests. So you need to have some knowledge of that. It cuts across kind of occupational therapy, speech and language therapy, and psychology, even though it's not a psychology assessment, it's not a speech and language therapy assessment. It's not a occupational therapy assessment. Another important thing that you really need to know is that not all of these professions are able to give a diagnosis. So the only professions that can give a diagnosis are paediatricians, psychiatrists, specialty doctors if they specialise in this area, and clinical psychologists. So if you're not one of those professions, you need to make sure that you are working with someone who is. So it's great to have more than one profession doing an autism assessment, because then you just have a really wide knowledge base. So not all of those professions are registered with the Health and Care Professions Council, and this can be a problem in that the NHS, when they have right to choose contracts, they only employ people who are registered with the HCPC or similar bodies. So that's an important thing to know. People are really looking for assessors who can just hit the ground running. So they often ask for at least a year's experience, and that is something else to be aware of. There are some companies who do take on people and then they help them to develop those skills and then they start working for them, but not everywhere. You definitely need to think about how you're going to get that experience and support once you have done the training. I really hope that this is helpful, because I think that a lot of people don't know this information, and I think you have to know. So if you do go ahead and train, I really wish you all the very best, and maybe our paths will cross if you come onto one of my training courses. But as I said, I just hope it's helpful to know this information.